I once believed love in a family was unshakable, that the hands I held as children would be the same hands reaching for mine when my strength began to fade. I believed the faces around my table smiled because they cared, not because they were calculating what they could take when I was gone. I was wrong. The change was quiet at first. A word here, a look there, until one day, I realized the warmth in my home had turned cold, and the voices that once comforted me now carried the weight of something far more dangerous. What I decided to do after that would leave them stunned, the town buzzing, and me finally at peace. Before I tell you what happened, hit like, subscribe so you'll hear the whole story, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what you think could drive a parent to make a choice like mine. My daughter-in-law, Linda, casually listed the value of my mansion, stressing how someday they would sell it to make smarter investments. I'm Harold Bennett, 72, the kind of old man strangers describe as spry because I still walk straight, still drive myself to the grocery store, and still remember the names of the boys who laid the bricks on the first store I ever opened. I built a chain of hardware stores with long hours, calloused hands, and a stubborn streak you could use to anchor a bridge. 40 years later, I have a portfolio the bank calls diversified, and my son calls his future. I never signed a single paper promising him any of it. On the evening in question, the late September sun was slanting through Stephen's picture window, slick as a magazine, ad over the farmhouse table he insists is authentic reclaimed oak. He likes words like authentic. He likes the appearance of things that were earned, even when he didn't earn them. He'd invited me for dinner to catch up, which in Stephen speak usually means there's an angle I haven't spotted yet. I showed up on time with a lemon pie from the bakery down on Maple and a small bouquet for Linda because my mother raised me to never come empty-handed. Linda took the flowers with a tight smile, already glancing past me at the oven timer. Stephen clinked a wine glass to get everyone's attention. Linda, their son Ethan, and the new granite countertops, and launched into a toast about family, legacy, and smart planning. Then he looked at me and delivered his line with the brazen confidence of a man who believes the world is a stage built for his spotlight. Dad only lives on pills and signing checks now. The laugh he tacked on the end was soft, performative, like he thought the insult would land better if it wore a tuxedo. I felt the heat rise to my ears, but I let it pass. Years in business taught me that the man who wins is usually the man who keeps his mouth shut first. I cut into my roast beef, took a bite, and concentrated on the familiar things. The peppers bite, the way the gravy pooled against the potatoes, the silver scrape of a knife against the plate. Linda, emboldened by Stephen's performance, started musing aloud about the current market. "Harold, the West Side is exploding," she said, like she was reading from a brochure. "Your place could fetch, what, mid-sevens? Maybe eights? Someday, we should really put it in the right hands and reinvest. Smarter money, better yields." She didn't say the word inheritance. She didn't have to. The word hung there anyway, invisible but heavy, like humidity before a thunderstorm. Ethan, fresh from college and verbosity, chimed in that a liquidity event would unlock family potential, and I pictured him unlocking a shopping cart full of sneakers and gadgets he'd outgrow in 6 months. I tried to steer the conversation to something harmless, the high school football team, the leaf colors out by the lake, but Stephen kept looping it back to planning, sliding casual questions across the table the way a card sharp slides aces. Did I have updated beneficiaries? Were my accounts consolidated? Had I considered gifting strategies now so you can watch your legacy at work? A legacy, in my mind, isn't a stack of statements. It's the way employees still wave when they see you on the street. It's the college scholarship you set up for kids who fix lawn mowers after class to help their parents. It's not a toy chest for grown children who missed the lesson of earning. I sipped water and watched my son, noting the way he sat at the head of his table, as if he were rehearsing for another role. The patriarch, the king who has inherited more than land, the right to decide. He inherited my blue eyes, but not the discipline that sharpened them. He inherited my last name, but not the good manners that gave it standing. That evening, as soon as we sat down, Stephen leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine as though it was his God-given right to hold court. "Dad," he said with a smirk, "if you ever get tired of that cabin in Aspen, I can take it off your hands. Wouldn't want you straining yourself with upkeep at your age." He shot a look at his wife, and she laughed as if he had just delivered the cleverest joke of the night. I could feel the familiar burn of contempt rising, but I said nothing, choosing instead to watch. Across the table, Linda, my daughter-in-law, began rattling off the market values of every property I owned: my townhouse in Denver, the ranch in Wyoming, the shares in a small vineyard I'd bought decades ago. Finishing with a casual, "One day this portfolio could really be optimized for returns." Optimized. That was her word for liquidating every memory I had and turning it into cash they could spend without a shred of sentiment. My youngest, Paul, wasn't much better. He'd always been quieter, but that night he decided to join the game. "Dad, about that trust fund, the one you set up for the grandkids, have you thought about increasing it? College is getting expensive." He said it with the wide-eyed innocence of a man who thought I'd forgotten how he'd just bought a new fishing boat last summer. I kept my voice even. "Paul, the trust is doing exactly what it's meant to. No need to tinker with it." The smile that didn't reach his eyes told me he'd keep pressing in the weeks to come. Dessert was barely served before they steered the conversation toward my health. "How's your memory holding up, Dad?" Stephen asked, with just enough feigned concern to make it sting. These days they say it's better to plan things early before it's too late." The unspoken meaning hung in the air. Make sure your will is finalized before you lose your mind. I nodded slowly, letting them think their words had landed. What they didn't know was that my will had been final for months, and none of them were in for the windfall they imagined. I watched them that night, really watched them, their eyes lighting up when property values were mentioned, their polite but hollow laughs when I spoke of anything sentimental, the way they avoided asking about my actual life, my thoughts, my happiness. They were vultures in polite clothing, circling a man they believed was too close to the ground to fight back. And I realized something as I sat there pushing pie around my plate. They had already decided I was nothing more than an inheritance waiting to be claimed. The warmth of family was gone, replaced with a calculating chill that reminded me of the businessmen I'd outnegotiated in my youth. Only this time, the sharks had my blood in their veins. As the evening ended, Linda kissed my cheek, leaving a faint scent of her expensive perfume, and whispered, "We're only looking out for you." I smiled and told her I know. But what I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, was that they weren't looking out for me. They were looking out for what they thought would soon be theirs. I stood at the door watching them leave, their laughter echoing down the walkway, and felt a strange calm settle over me. Let them scheme. Let them count what they believe is already in their pockets. They had no idea that their greed had already sealed their fate. That week, Stephen called me out of the blue, his tone unusually casual, but carrying that same undercurrent of expectation. "Dad," he began, "there's a charity gala next weekend, and I think it'd be great if you stayed home. Rest. These events can be exhausting for you. Linda and I will go in your place and represent the family." He didn't ask, he told. And though the idea of them schmoozing in my name without me irritated me, I let him think I agreed without protest. "If that's what you think is best," I said, knowing full well the real reason. The gala was hosted by an old business partner of mine, and Stephen wanted to work the room as if he were already the man in charge. That Saturday night, while there were no doubt sipping champagne and flashing smiles, I sat alone with a modest supper and an old jazz record playing in the background. I wasn't sad, just sharper in my awareness. They were starting to ease me out of circles that had been mine for decades, rewriting the narrative so they could step in as if they had always been there. 2 weeks later, the exclusion became even more blatant. Thanksgiving was approaching, and for as long as I could remember, it had been my holiday to host. The long table in my dining room, the smell of roasting turkey, the laughter of grandkids chasing each other through the hallways. These were constants in my life. But this year, Stephen called me 3 days before the holiday with an announcement, not an invitation. "Dad, we're doing Thanksgiving at the Grandview Hotel this year. Private room, chef's tasting menu, very upscale. We thought it might be a bit much for you. Crowds, noise, all that. So, you can just relax at home. We'll bring you some leftovers if you want." The way he said it, as if I were a fragile relic best kept on a shelf, was more cutting than any open insult. I asked, evenly, "Will everyone be there?" He hesitated just a fraction too long before replying, "Yeah, it's going to be a full family thing. Paul, Linda's parents, the kids. You know, the works." They were all going, and I was deliberately left out. The message was clear. My presence was no longer essential to the family gatherings that I had built my traditions around. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen, the ticking of the old wall clock sounding louder than usual. I pictured them all dressed up, clinking glasses over a meal I'd paid for in one way or another, my name perhaps mentioned briefly before being swept aside in favor of talk about the future and plans. On Thanksgiving Day, the house felt unnervingly still. I made myself a small plate, roast chicken instead of turkey, mashed potatoes from scratch, cranberry sauce from a jar, and ate at the kitchen table with the radio murmuring in the background. At some point, I imagined Ethan making some snide remark about me being set in my ways, and Linda leaning in to joke about how Dad probably wouldn't have appreciated the tasting menu anyway. They would laugh, thinking themselves clever, blind to the fact that each small act of exclusion was pushing me further from the role they believed I would play in their future. Later that afternoon, my neighbor Susan stopped by with a slice of pumpkin pie and a brief visit. She asked if I was spending the evening with family, and I told her they had other plans this year. Her brow furrowed in sympathy, but I waved it off, not wanting pity. What I wanted was clarity, and I had it now in abundance. They were not just greedy. They were willing to erase me from the very fabric of the family if it made their path to my estate smoother. The next day, I drove past the Grandview Hotel, not to spy, but to see for myself the place they had chosen over my home. Through the tall glass windows, I glimpsed a glittering dining room, Stephen at the head of the table, gesturing grandly as if he were the patriarch. Linda was laughing, leaning toward someone with that well-practiced charm she used like currency. I didn't linger, but in that fleeting view, I understood something important. They were already rehearsing for a world without me. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought about how unfairness often starts small. One unreturned call, one event you're better off skipping, and then grows into a pattern until the person being excluded begins to question their place entirely. They weren't going to push me into doubt. If anything, their attempts to sideline me were giving me the distance I needed to make a decision without sentiment clouding my judgment. They didn't know it yet, but every act of exclusion was a gift, proof I could use to justify what I was planning. I went about my days quietly, morning walks, tending to the woodpile, checking the stock reports with my coffee. But beneath the surface, I was cataloging every slight, every way they were pushing me further out of my own family. Then came the night that showed me just how little respect they had left. It was early December when I attended a community fundraiser at the Old Town Hall, an event I had supported for decades. I'd helped restore the building, sat on the planning committee in its lean years, and had donated enough over the decades to see my name etched into the donor plaque by the front entrance. I arrived wearing my best suit, the one I'd had tailored 15 years ago, but that still fit comfortably. And as I walked in, I saw Stephen standing by the refreshment table, drink in hand, speaking to a small group of local business owners. I made my way over, smiling and greeting, but before I could say a word, Stephen looked at me and with a dismissive chuckle told the group, "That's my dad. He used to run some hardware stores back in the day. Now, he mostly just keeps busy with crossword puzzles." The laughter that followed was polite, but tinged with the condescension people reserve for those they believe are past their prime. I stood there, hearing the subtle but deliberate way he had stripped me down to a hobby and a memory, and I knew it wasn't an accident. That was Stephen's way of signaling to his peers that I was no longer a man to be taken seriously, that the baton had been passed, and that he was the one worth dealing with now. Later that same evening, I overheard another gem. Linda, in her glittering cocktail dress, was chatting with one of the town council members about a potential redevelopment project. I caught the words "when we inherit" and "we'll have so much more flexibility," and though I didn't hear the rest, I didn't need to. Her tone was light, almost playful, but her intent was razor sharp. She was planting the idea in others' minds that the transfer of my estate was not only inevitable, but imminent. They weren't even trying to be discreet anymore. By the end of the night, I felt less like a guest and more like a ghost haunting a room where no one thought I belonged. A week later, the disrespect turned from subtle to brazen. I stopped by Stephen's house unannounced to drop off a set of vintage tools I thought Ethan might appreciate. Tools I'd had since my early days in the business, each one with its own story. When I arrived, the door was slightly ajar, and as I stepped inside, I heard voices from the living room. Stephen was on the phone with someone, and his voice carried clearly through the hall. "Honestly, once Dad's gone, we're going to redo everything. Sell off the smaller properties, consolidate the investments. He's got stuff scattered everywhere. It's inefficient. We'll be in a much stronger position once we're in control." I froze there, holding the toolbox, feeling the weight of the metal matched only by the weight in my chest. He wasn't just talking about my assets. He was talking about dismantling my life's work like it was nothing more than clutter in a garage. I quietly set the toolbox down by the door and left without saying a word. Driving home, I kept thinking about how easy it had been for him to speak of me in the past tense while I was still very much alive. It was as if, in his mind, I had already been reduced to a line in a ledger. That night, I sat in my study and began writing out what I'd call my ledger of wrongs, a list of every moment in recent years where they had publicly or privately diminished me. This wasn't about nursing a grudge. It was about documenting a pattern so clear that even an outsider could see it for what it was. I wrote about the gala, about Thanksgiving, about the fundraiser and the phone call. And as the list grew, I felt something in me shift from quiet resignation to deliberate resolve. If they wanted to treat me as though I were already gone, then perhaps I should consider what kind of legacy I wanted to leave when I truly was. The final straw of that month came at the Christmas market in town, where I ran into an old friend, George, who told me he'd heard from Stephen that I was slowing down and handing over the reins. George said it kindly, without malice, but I could see the pity in his eyes, and I knew exactly where it had come from. The public disrespect had reached the point where even my oldest friends were being fed a version of me that wasn't true. They were shaping the narrative before I had a chance to speak for myself. As I walked home through the crisp night air, the streetlights casting long shadows on the snow, I realized that whatever I decided to do next would not be out of anger alone. It would be calculated, deliberate, and final. They wanted control. They would get none. They wanted the world to see me as a relic. Then I would give them a surprise so modern in its execution that they'd never recover from the shock. That night, I sat at my desk and pulled out the folder containing my will. I didn't change anything yet, but I placed a fresh sheet of paper on top and wrote one sentence. A legacy should go to those who value the person, not the possessions. Underneath, I wrote Molly's name. I didn't need to look it up. I remembered it as clearly as the day I first saw her, the kindness in her eyes when she served me that bowl of soup years ago. She had no idea the role she might play in my future, but the seed had been planted. My family had done the rest by watering it with their greed and their disrespect. This became painfully clear one cold January afternoon when Stephen and Linda came to my house under the guise of a casual visit. I had been in the study, reading through old letters my late wife had written me when they arrived unannounced. Linda walked in first, her eyes scanning the room like an appraiser, while Stephen trailed behind carrying a folder. "Dad," Stephen began, settling into the armchair opposite me, "we've been talking about how to make things easier for you around here. The house is big, and well, you don't need all this space. It's a lot to keep up with, especially in winter." I closed the letter I had been holding and asked him plainly what he meant. Linda leaned forward, her voice syrupy, but her words sharp. "We found a lovely assisted living community just 20 minutes from here. It's got all the amenities, medical staff on call, activities, great food. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." The implication was clear. They wanted me out of my home. I told them I was perfectly capable of maintaining my own life. But Stephen pressed on, flipping open the folder to reveal glossy brochures and a checklist of transition steps. He spoke as though this was already decided, explaining how the move could be quick and painless, how they could handle selling the house and managing the proceeds. I sat there listening, my hands clasped to keep them from shaking, not from weakness, but from the sheer effort it took to hold back the anger that threatened to spill over. They were not offering help. They were staging an eviction masked as concern. The conversation ended with me making it clear I was staying put, but I could see the frustration in Stephen's jaw and the way Linda's smile tightened. They weren't used to me refusing their plans. 2 days later, their next move came. Stephen hired a new caretaker for me without asking. The woman, pleasant enough on the surface, showed up at my door saying she had been told she would assist with day-to-day tasks and keep an eye on things. When I confronted Stephen about it, he brushed it off. "Dad, you wander around in that garden of yours like it's the only thing you care about. We just want to make sure you don't slip on the ice or overexert yourself. Besides, it frees you up to relax." His words carried the same false concern I had been hearing for months. But this was different. It was a direct attempt to control my daily life. The caretaker's presence was suffocating. She hovered while I made my coffee, shadowed me while I worked in the shed, and asked questions about where I was going whenever I picked up my coat. I knew she was reporting back to Stephen and Linda, though she never said it outright. The indignity of it was worse than the inconvenience. For decades, I had been the man others relied on for guidance and decisions. And now my own son had installed a minder in my home as if I were incapable of crossing the street without supervision. One afternoon, I decided to test the limits of their little arrangement. I told the caretaker I was going for a walk and ended up taking the long route into town, stopping at the diner for coffee. When I returned, Stephen called within minutes. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone more demanding than concerned. I told him I'd gone for coffee. "You could have fallen or gotten lost," he said, as though I were a child who had wandered away from the playground. That was the moment I realized they didn't see me as a man anymore. They saw me as a fragile liability to be managed. A week later, the final indignity of this stage came during a small neighborhood gathering at Susan's house. We were in the living room, people mingling with drinks and plates of appetizers, when Linda, smiling as if she were making a charming joke, said loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "We've had to keep a close eye on Harold lately. He's always getting into little mishaps around the house." The laughter that followed was light, but I could feel my face burn. In one sentence, she had turned me into a punchline, stripping away decades of self-reliance and competence in front of my neighbors. I smiled thinly and excused myself soon after, walking home alone in the cold night air, my breath visible in the streetlights. By the time I reached my front door, I had made up my mind. The loss of dignity they were orchestrating wasn't accidental. It was strategic. They wanted to control my narrative, to weaken me in the eyes of others, so that when the time came for them to take everything, no one would question it. But they had made a critical mistake. They believed they were wearing me down, when in reality, they were making me stronger in my resolve. The more they tried to strip away my independence, the more determined I became to ensure they would never have control over my legacy. That night, I took out my will again and placed it on the desk. I didn't make changes yet, but I opened a fresh page in my notebook and wrote, Stage 5, Removal of Dignity in Progress. Countermeasures required. And beneath that, I wrote Molly's name once more, underlined twice. She was still only a memory in my day-to-day life, but in my plans, she was becoming central. In the quiet of my study, I imagined the look on Stephen's face when he learned that all his careful maneuvering, all his attempts to diminish me, had led to the opposite outcome. What they didn't understand was that I had been building a case, not in court, but in my own mind, recording every calculated slight, every manipulation, every attempt to reduce me from a man to a placeholder. The day the breaking point came, it was a Sunday, and the caretaker had taken the afternoon off. I was enjoying the rare quiet of my own home when Stephen arrived without calling first. He walked in with that same self-assured air he always carried now, not even removing his coat before saying, "Dad, we need to talk about consolidating the bank accounts. It's going to be a mess for us to manage later if they're spread all over the place." I asked him why we needed to manage anything, and he gave me a tight smile. Eventually, someone will have to, and it's better if it's all in order now. You know, fewer headaches for everyone. His tone made it clear he meant fewer headaches for himself, not me. Before I could respond, Linda walked in behind him holding a small stack of my mail, which she'd apparently taken from the porch on her way in. "You've got notices from the bank and your insurance," she said, flipping through them like she had every right. "You should really authorize us to open and sort these for you. It's just safer." That was the moment something in me snapped. I stood up, took the mail from her hands, and told them both, firmly and without raising my voice, "You will not manage my accounts. You will not open my mail. And you will not make another decision for me without my consent." The room went quiet for the first time in months, but the silence was heavy with tension. Stephen tried to laugh it off, saying I was being defensive, but I cut him off. "No, I'm being clear. This ends now." They exchanged a look that was equal parts disbelief and annoyance, and I could see the calculation behind their eyes, the rapid assessment of how their plans had just been delayed. The conversation turned into an argument, with Stephen accusing me of making things harder than they need to be and Linda insisting they were only protecting my best interests. I told them my best interests were not for them to decide. Finally, I asked them to leave, and after a long moment, they did, but not before Stephen muttered, "You'll regret making this so difficult." I watched them walk down the driveway, their shoulders stiff, their steps quick, and I knew something had shifted permanently between us. They would stop pretending now. The gloves would come off. Sure enough, the following week, I began receiving calls from people I'd known for years, business contacts, neighbors, even my old pastor, each of them awkwardly asking if I was all right because they'd heard I was struggling to manage things. The smear campaign had begun. Stephen and Linda were now openly telling people that I was forgetful, overwhelmed, and in need of serious oversight. One afternoon, I overheard two men outside the hardware store talking about how sad it was that I wasn't the man I used to be. It was like watching someone graffiti over the front of a building you'd spent your whole life constructing. The final blow came at a small winter festival in town, where I ran into Molly, the waitress who had once shown me kindness when no one else had. She greeted me warmly, asking how I'd been, and I told her honestly that it had been a rough season. She tilted her head, her expression shifting from friendly to concerned, and said, I heard you're not doing so well, that maybe you're going to be moving into one of those care places. Is that true? In that moment, hearing those words from her, of all people, I felt the weight of just how far Stephen and Linda's narrative had spread. They were dismantling my reputation so that when the time came to claim everything, no one would be surprised. But instead of breaking me, that moment lit a fire. Molly's concern wasn't laced with greed. It was genuine. She told me if I ever needed anything, even just someone to talk to, I could come by the diner. That offer, simple as it was, stood in stark contrast to the manipulations I'd been drowning in for months. As I walked home through the falling snow, I realized I had been holding back my decision, perhaps out of some faint hope that my family might change. That hope died completely that day. That night, I sat at my desk, pulled my will from the drawer, and began making the changes I had been contemplating since the first dinner where Stephen mocked me. I didn't rush it. I wrote carefully, deliberately, making sure every clause was airtight. I removed Stephen, Linda, and Paul entirely from any primary inheritance, leaving them only small, token amounts that would make my intent clear. It wasn't oversight, it was choice. The majority of my estate, every property, every account, every investment, was to go to Molly with a letter explaining why. I wrote that she had shown me kindness at a time when I was invisible to those who should have cared most. She had brought me soup without expecting anything in return, and that simple act had stayed with me longer than all the empty smiles and hollow words from my own blood. When I finished, I placed the revised will in a sealed envelope and locked it in the safe, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. They had spent months trying to strip me of my dignity, to paint me as incapable, to edge me out of my own life. All they had done was prove beyond any doubt that they didn't deserve what they thought was theirs. The week after I rewrote my will, a strange calm settled over me, like the stillness before a storm when you know something big is coming, but you're not afraid anymore. For months, I'd been reacting to Stephen and Linda's manipulations, their greed, and their quiet campaign to strip me of dignity. Now, the balance had shifted. I was no longer on the defensive. I had made my move, and while they didn't know it yet, every step they took from here on out would only tighten the noose they had tied for themselves. I went about my days with the quiet satisfaction of a man carrying a secret too big to share. The first opportunity to begin setting the stage for the reveal came when Stephen called to tell me there would be a family meeting at his house the following Saturday. His tone was the smug, patronizing one he used when he thought he was about to unveil something important. I agreed to come, not because I cared about his agenda, but because I saw the meeting for what it was, an opportunity to let them keep showing their true colors. When I arrived, Linda greeted me with a glass of water. No coffee, no tea, just plain water, as if I were some frail patient on a strict diet, and ushered me into the living room where Stephen and Paul were already seated. Stephen cleared his throat like a CEO about to give a quarterly report. Dad, we've been thinking about the future, he began, and we believe it's time to start moving assets into a family trust. That way, there's less tax burden when, the time comes. He actually had the nerve to say, when the time comes, as if my death were a calendar event already penciled in. Paul nodded along, adding, we could structure it so the properties and investments are managed by us, freeing you from stress. I asked if by freeing me they meant removing me, and Stephen smirked. We just want what's best for everyone. I let them speak for nearly 20 minutes, detailing how they'd reallocate my holdings, which properties they'd sell first, and how they'd modernize my investment portfolio. The arrogance was almost impressive. They were talking about dismantling my life's work right to my face, confident I would nod along like a docile old man. When they finally paused, I said, "You've certainly put a lot of thought into this, but I think you've overlooked one important detail." Stephen leaned forward, ready to counter what he assumed would be a minor objection. "What detail?" I looked each of them in the eye and said, "It's not yours to decide." That landed like a stone dropped in still water. Their smiles faltered, and for the first time in months, I saw something new in their eyes. Not just frustration, but uncertainty. I stood, thanked them for the water, and left without another word. Driving home, I felt the beginnings of satisfaction, not because I'd told them off, but because I could sense their control slipping. They'd been so sure they were steering the ship, and now they weren't certain where the current was taking them. I knew they would spend the next week talking about that meeting, dissecting my tone, and wondering if I had already taken steps to protect what they thought was theirs. They'd be right, of course, but they wouldn't guess how far I'd gone. That Sunday, I went to the diner. Molly was working the morning shift, weaving between tables with the same quiet grace she'd had years ago when she'd first served me that bowl of soup. When she came by to take my order, I asked if she could sit for a moment after the rush. She agreed, curiosity flickering in her expression. Later, over coffee, I told her I was updating some personal affairs and might need her help with something down the line. I didn't go into detail, there was no need yet, but I saw the way she listened, really listened, without interrupting or assuming. Before I left, I paid for my coffee and slipped her an envelope, telling her to open it when she got home. It contained a simple letter thanking her for her kindness years ago, along with a note that said, "Kindness matters more than blood." I wanted her to have that seed planted in her mind before anything else happened. Meanwhile, Stephen and Linda's behavior toward me shifted in subtle ways. They started calling more often, but the calls were clearly fishing expeditions disguised as check-ins. "Hey, Dad, just wondering if you've made any changes to your insurance lately? Or have you thought about updating the titles on the cars? Might make things smoother later." I answered politely but vaguely, giving them nothing to latch onto. The less they knew, the more they would speculate, and speculation would gnaw at them more than any confrontation. A week later, Stephen invited me to a charity auction. I knew the invitation wasn't genuine. He wanted me to be seen publicly in his company so he could continue projecting the image of himself as the responsible son managing his aging father's affairs. I went anyway, not to help him, but to watch him. At the event, I stayed quiet, greeting old acquaintances who were surprised to see me after the rumors Stephen had been spreading. One even said, "You're looking great, Harold. I'd heard you were slowing down." I smiled and replied, "Don't believe everything you hear." I made sure Stephen heard that. That night, after the auction, I sat in my study and looked again at the will in the safe. The decision was made. The legal work was already in motion. But now I began to think about the reveal, not just at the will reading, but in the moments leading up to it. I wanted them to walk into that room with absolute certainty that they were about to inherit everything, only to watch that certainty shatter. I began making notes, small steps I could take to reinforce their false confidence. Asking Stephen's advice on trivial matters, pretending to consider some of his modernization ideas, and even hinting at selling a property or two, knowing it would fuel his belief that I was finally giving in. The more convinced they became, the harder the fall would be. That suited me perfectly. I began to craft the illusion I wanted them to believe. I called Stephen one afternoon to ask his opinion on whether I should sell one of the smaller properties, a rundown rental I'd owned for decades and never done much with. I knew the question would light up his mind like a winning lottery ticket, and I could practically hear the greed tighten in his voice as he told me, "Yes, definitely, Dad. No point in holding on to something that's losing value." I thanked him as if his advice mattered, while knowing that property would remain exactly where it was until Molly decided otherwise. The next week, I called Linda and asked her to help me choose a new accountant. She jumped at the chance, likely imagining she could find someone pliable enough to share information with her. I agreed to meet with her recommendations, all the while making a private appointment with my own trusted attorney to finalize every clause of my revised will. If my children were going to walk into the final moment believing they had one, then I would make sure every step leading there felt like confirmation of their victory. At the same time, I began visiting the diner more often, always sitting in Molly's section. Sometimes I ordered breakfast, sometimes just coffee, but each time I made sure to talk with her, to learn about her life, her challenges, her hopes. I discovered she worked double shifts most weeks to cover her mother's medical expenses, and that she often stayed late at the diner to help the night staff clean, even when it wasn't her job. These weren't grand gestures meant to impress anyone. They were quiet acts of responsibility and kindness, the kind of qualities my own children seemed to have misplaced years ago. One afternoon, as I was leaving, I slipped her another envelope, this time containing a small check to help with her mother's care. She protested, saying she couldn't accept it, but I told her it was a loan, one she could repay any time in the next 100 years. Her smile was shy but grateful, and I knew that if she ever did receive my estate, she would honor it far more than my family ever would. Meanwhile, Stephen began pressing harder, clearly emboldened by what he thought was my gradual concession. He started sending me draft plans for how to restructure the estate, complete with timelines for selling properties and reinvesting the funds. I responded with polite interest, occasionally asking questions to make him think I was taking his ideas seriously. Paul, not wanting to be left out, began hinting at how the grandkids could really use a better start in life, and suggesting I simplify my holdings so they'd be easier to manage later. They thought they were aligning me with their vision, when in reality, I was leading them further into a fog of false confidence. My attorney, a discreet and capable man named Harris, called one morning to confirm that the changes were complete and legally airtight. "Once you sign these," he said, "there's no room for dispute. It will stand no matter how loud they protest." That was exactly what I needed to hear. I signed the documents that afternoon, leaving no doubt about where my estate would go. Molly's name was now attached to every major asset, with specific instructions for charitable donations in her mother's name. My children were left token amounts that would serve as a clear statement. They were excluded not by accident, but by intent. With the legal foundation secured, I turned my focus to the performance that would make the final moment unforgettable. The will reading would be the stage, but the weeks leading up to it would be the rehearsal. I made sure to spend time with my children, feigning a softening of my stance. I let Stephen accompany me to a property inspection, letting him talk at length about upgrades and market timing, nodding at all the right moments. I asked Linda's opinion on small household matters, what color to paint the front door, which flowers to plant in spring, feeding her belief that she was becoming my trusted advisor. I even gave Paul a vintage fishing rod I no longer used, a gesture he took as a sign of growing generosity, when in reality, it was nothing more than another layer of camouflage. Every interaction was designed to reinforce the same story, that I was slowly, finally, handing over the reins. I could see the satisfaction in their faces, the smugness in their voices. They believed the end game was theirs. They began talking more openly in front of me about, when the time comes, even making casual jokes about what they do with certain properties. Each comment only fueled my determination to make the reveal all the more devastating. The final piece of the setup came when I invited all three of them to dinner at my house, framing it as a thank you for their recent help. I cooked the meal myself. Roast beef, potatoes, green beans, the kind of hearty fare they'd grown up with but rarely appreciated. Over dinner, I thanked them for their guidance and support, careful to make it sound sincere. I watched their eyes meet across the table, little smirks passing between them as they interpreted my words as surrender. They didn't realize that every thank you was another brick in the wall closing them out. When they left that night, I stood at the door and watched them walk to their cars, chatting and laughing like conspirators who believe the job is already done. I closed the door, locked it, and went to my study. On my desk was a single envelope with Harris's business card clipped to it. I placed it in the center of the desk, knowing that soon it would be handed to them in a lawyer's office. They would open it expecting confirmation of everything they'd been working toward, only to discover that their entire strategy had been built on a lie I had let them believe. Everything I had set in motion had led to this moment. By 10 o'clock, I was at Harris's office. The conference room was long and narrow, with polished oak walls and a table that could seat 12. Harris had already prepared the documents, each one in a neat folder. A pitcher of water and glasses sat in the center of the table, untouched. One by one, they arrived, Stephen first, his steps brisk and his handshake firm, his face wearing that confident smirk I had grown used to. Linda followed, perfectly dressed, her perfume announcing her before she entered. Paul was last, looking less sure of himself, but still expectant. They sat together on one side of the table, like a unified front ready to receive their spoils. I sat opposite them, calm and silent, letting them interpret my composure however they wished. Harris began by explaining the formalities, his voice steady, his eyes scanning the room. Stephen leaned back, his hands folded across his chest. Linda's fingers rested lightly on his arm, and Paul stared at the folder in front of him like it was already a treasure chest. Harris opened the first page and began to read. My children's names came first, each followed by the bequests I had left them. Modest sums, carefully chosen so there could be no claim of oversight. The numbers landed like drops of cold rain. Stephen's smirk faltered, Linda's mouth opened slightly, and Paul's eyebrows shot up. "That's it," Stephen interrupted. Harris, without looking up, said, "As stated in the will." Linda leaned forward. "What about the properties? The estate? The vineyard?" Harris turned the page and read. "All remaining assets, including but not limited to all real estate holdings, investment accounts, business shares, and personal property, are to be transferred in their entirety to Ms. Molly Parker." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Stephen blinked, as if the name didn't make sense to him, and Paul sat back hard in his chair. Linda was the first to find her voice. "Who the hell is Molly Parker?" Her tone was sharp, almost shrill, the control she prided herself on cracking wide open. I kept my voice calm. "She's a waitress at the diner downtown. Years ago, when I was alone and at my lowest, she brought me a bowl of soup and treated me like a person when my own family didn't notice I was struggling. I never forgot that." Stephen laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "You're leaving everything to some stranger because she gave you soup?" I met his eyes. "I'm leaving everything to someone who showed me kindness without calculation. That's worth more than all the meetings, the plans, and the thinly veiled greed I've seen from you." Paul tried to intervene, saying, "Dad, this doesn't make sense. We're your family." I leaned forward, my hands folded. "Family isn't just blood, Paul. Family is who shows up when you need them, who treats you with respect, who values you as a person, not a prize. For months, maybe years, you've all made it clear that I'm nothing more than an inheritance waiting to happen. You try to move me out of my home, control my accounts, paint me as incapable to my friends. You didn't protect me. You tried to dismantle me. Harris continued reading the legal language, each word hammering the truth deeper into their stunned expressions. Stephen shifted in his chair, his face flushing red, while Linda muttered something under her breath about contesting the will. Harris, anticipating this, set down his papers and said, "This document was prepared in full legal compliance, witnessed, and notarized. There are no grounds for contest under current law. Any challenge would be futile." Stephen looked at me like he didn't recognize the man sitting across from him. "You planned this," he said, his voice low and tight. I nodded once. "Every step of it. Every time you thought I was giving in, I was giving you just enough rope to hang your own chances. You showed me who you were, and I believed you." Linda slammed her folder shut and stood. "This is ridiculous. She's nobody." I looked at her without blinking. "She's somebody who never tried to take anything from me. That shut her up, though the anger in her eyes was a storm." Paul looked at me for a long moment, then down at his folder, as if finally realizing that every assumption he had made about the future was gone. The meeting ended with Harris sliding a separate envelope across the table to me. It contained a letter I had written to Molly, explaining her inheritance and my reasons for giving it to her. I left without another word to my children. Outside, the cold air felt sharp and clean in my lungs. I walked down the street to the diner, where Molly was working the lunch shift. She greeted me with a smile, unaware of what had just happened. I ordered coffee, sat at my usual table, and watched her move through the room, greeting customers, refilling cups, laughing softly at someone's joke. When she brought my coffee, I handed her the envelope. "Open this when you're home," I said. She frowned slightly, sensing the weight of it, but nodded. In the days after the will reading, the silence from Stephen, Linda, and Paul was almost deafening. For months, they had been a constant presence in my life. Calls, visits, unsolicited advice. But now it was as if they'd vanished, retreating to lick their wounds and, no doubt, curse my name behind closed doors. I didn't miss the noise. I went about my routines with a newfound peace, tending my garden, walking to the diner for coffee, and spending evenings in my study without the constant undercurrent of manipulation pressing at me. I knew they were angry, maybe even humiliated, but that was the point. Humiliation is a bitter teacher, and I hoped that somewhere in their frustration, they might see the truth of why this happened. Whether they learned from it or not was beyond my control. My part was done. 3 days later, Molly came to my door. She stood there holding the envelope I'd given her at the diner, her eyes wide and her hands trembling slightly. "Harold, I don't know what to say," she whispered. I invited her in, made her tea, and told her to sit. She sat stiffly, like someone afraid the chair might vanish beneath her. "I read your letter," she said finally. "I don't understand why you would do this for me." I told her the story, how years ago I had walked into the diner feeling invisible, my family too busy or too self-absorbed to notice I was slipping into a kind of quiet despair. How she, a stranger, had brought me soup, called me sir with genuine respect, and treated me like I mattered. "That might have been just another day for you," I said, "but for me, it was the first time in months I felt like I wasn't already gone." She wiped at her eyes, shaking her head. "It was just kindness." "Exactly," I said. "Kindness without expectation. That's rare, and it's worth more than all the empty smiles I've had to sit through from people who were supposed to love me." We talked for over an hour, and by the time she left, I could see the weight of the gift settling into her, not as a windfall to be flaunted, but as a responsibility to be honored. That was what I wanted. I didn't want my estate to become another trophy for greed. I wanted it to live on as something built on gratitude and integrity. Meanwhile, the ripples from the will reading began to spread through the community. People who had believed Stephen and Linda's narrative about my supposed decline were now asking questions. They wanted to know why a man would bypass his own children for a waitress. Some were critical, but many nodded in quiet understanding, recalling their own experiences with family members who valued money over relationships. The truth has a way of seeping out, and slowly, the whispers about my incompetence were replaced with murmurs about my children's greed. I hadn't planned it that way, but I didn't mind. One afternoon, as I was pruning the roses in my front yard, Paul stopped by. He didn't come up the walk right away. He stood by the gate, hands in his pockets, staring at the ground. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't make it easy for him." I asked what he was sorry for, and after a long pause, he said, "For treating you like you were already gone, for not listening, for thinking about what you had instead of who you are." It wasn't everything I wanted to hear, but it was a start. I told him that trust, once broken, doesn't come back with words. It comes back with actions, and that he'd have to decide what kind of man he wanted to be from here on out. He nodded, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the boy he'd once been before ambition clouded his heart. Stephen and Linda never came. I heard through mutual acquaintances that they were considering selling their own home to cover debts they had counted on my estate to erase. That was their problem now. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had spent so much energy trying to secure a future that was never promised, and in doing so, they'd lost the one thing they could have had me. Money can be replaced, relationships can't, but they traded one for the other and ended up with neither. As winter turned to spring, Molly and I began meeting once a week for lunch. She told me about the renovations she wanted to make to the diner, about how she planned to use part of her inheritance to set up a scholarship fund in her mother's name for local kids who couldn't afford college. I listened, proud in a way I hadn't felt toward anyone in a long time. She didn't see the money as hers alone. She saw it as a tool to do something good. That was the difference. That was why she had it, and they didn't. One Sunday morning, I sat in my garden watching the light fall through the budding branches, and it struck me that this, right here, was the real victory. Not the deprivation of wealth from those who didn't deserve it, but the act of placing it in hands that would honor it. My children's anger would fade eventually, replaced by whatever lives they chose to build without my help. Molly's life, on the other hand, was already changing, and in ways that would echo far beyond either of us. That was my legacy, not the properties, not the accounts, but the choice to value character over bloodline, action over entitlement. In the end, this wasn't about revenge, though they would probably see it that way for the rest of their lives. It was about sending a message that love, respect, and kindness cannot be demanded, bought, or faked, and that they are worth more than all the money in the world. My hope was that someday, perhaps long after I'm gone, my children might look back and realize that they could have been the ones sitting in Molly's place if they had chosen differently. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. Either way, I will have left this world knowing I put my trust where it was earned, not where it was expected. The end. If you stayed with me through this whole story, thank you. I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one I share. I've told you what happened to me, but I want to hear from you now. What did you think of the way it all turned out? Do you believe I made the right choice with my will, or would you have done things differently in my shoes? And where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. I always enjoy knowing where my stories are reaching.